And we'd like to welcome you to the airwaves. Stephen Davis, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Adam and Michael, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
You know, I've been involved in this since 1982. I began questioning infectious AIDS in 82, and at that time we were questioning the early treatments for people with AIDS, which were aggressive chemotherapies and aggressive radiation, and even back then we felt that that was a serious danger to these people. By the time they announced that a virus had been found and was responsible, I was pretty sure that it wasn't an infectious syndrome. It didn't make sense. And I watched the dissident movement emerge. I watched various dissidents come forward based on their own expertise and experience. So I was very aware of Duisburg. It was like a major happening. And I just wonder, what moved you to write a book and to become an activist in this particular subject?
Oh, Michael, that's a great question. First of all, from my experience in government and also in medicine, I really didn't believe the HIV theory when it first came out, for lots of what I think are obvious reasons. HIV it's a very special kind of virus called a retrovirus, as you know. And even the gentleman who discovered it, Dr. Luc Montagnier in Paris, France in 1983, even Dr. Montagnier in 1990-91 admitted and said that HIV could not be the cause of AIDS. And he also said one of these things called a retrovirus has never caused harm in a human being. It has never been responsible for killing the huge numbers of cells that must be killed in order for someone to develop AIDS. And so I was skeptical from the very beginning, just like you. Along comes the early 1990s, and we're getting scared to death. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are trying to tell everyone that this is going to spread wildly throughout the population, including the heterosexual population, and they're making everyone afraid, frankly, of having sex. Well, having sex is something I like to do a lot when I can. And I was angry that they would take such a beautiful, powerful, spiritual experience as making love and make people so afraid of it. So when Peter Duisberg's book came out in 1996, I literally sat down and read it in 3 days. And then I wrote a paper published on the Internet called AIDSgate, because what I do best is I take very complicated concepts and I translate them into 3-letter words that then I can understand and hopefully others can as well. So my paper on the Internet essentially took Peter's book, Dr. Duisberg's book, Inventing the AIDS Virus, and others that I studied, and condensed this into a very simple format. And in that paper, I suggested that what should happen is that people should file a class action lawsuit against Robert Gallo, against the FDA, against the Department of Health and Human Services, and against the drug company that made this very lethal drug called AZT. At that time, the drug company was named Burroughs Wellcome. Today, it's called GlaxoSmithKline. And I hoped that a class action suit would be filed against these people, and the truth would finally come out in sworn testimony in court. And when I posted that on the Internet, I frankly, gentlemen, thought I was done with this issue, and I walked away. But unfortunately, nobody filed that class action suit. I'm told that other private suits were filed and were settled for lots of money by the drug company, but also with the stipulation that nothing ever be made public. So the public has never had the opportunity to hear sworn testimony about HIV, about AIDS, and about AZT. So finally in 2003, I said, well, if nobody's actually going to file this case, I will write a movie as if it did happen. And I wrote a screenplay. It was a 4-hour, 2-part made-for-TV movie, which actually, believe it or not, came in second in a screenwriting contest, but nobody would produce it. It was, of course, way too controversial. So last year I decided I would take that screenplay and turn it into a novel. And that is what my book's all about, Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial. It is a fictitious courtroom drama, a class action lawsuit, but it is also based entirely on medical and scientific studies. As a matter of fact, I list over 900 of these medical and scientific studies in the back of my book and on my website, which is www.theaidstrial.com, so that anyone who wants to can go look at these references and decide for themselves. That's how this book came about.
You know, for just making a simple point, just for the citations alone, it's worth the price of your book. It's an excellent compilation of references, quite extensive and very, very powerful to someone who's not sure. You know, when I listen to you, first, I'm a child of the 60s, and I, too, enjoy sex and am pro-sex. I thought it was sexual terrorism to tell people who have no risk that they are at risk for a deadly sexually transmitted disease. We have a generation now who's grown up believing that sex equals death. And I think that really is a crime against their basic humanity. One of the problems I had with the AIDS construct, and it's the idea that these low T-cell counts, regardless of what might be causing them, could account for the diseases that are under the syndrome and the umbrella AIDS. Now, in my direct experience, and later on I saw lots of scientific research that backed it up, there is no single paper anywhere that shows low T-cell counts can explain why people are getting sick. In fact, the Concord study kind of made this surrogate marker useless. It demonstrated it had no value whatsoever as a predictive of benefits for drugs or for the progression of disease. So it seems to me that the basic construct that anything is lowering T-cell counts. Another factor is under stress, T-cells migrate. So when a person is stressed, T-cells move into the skin, they move into organs where you couldn't count them. But they're there and they're viable. And it seems to me that when someone tests positive, that's very stressful. And when people are chronically stressed, their T-cells tend to rest in the organs and skin. So I would like to see a complete challenge to every aspect of the construct.
Absolutely, Michael. I'm absolutely with you. And think of the stress that is caused when someone is told they are HIV positive. And frankly, without any kind of proof, because I assume we'll have a chance
to
talk about the HIV blood test. But just taking the very simple statistics of these HIV blood tests, of 100 people who take the ELISA test and test positive the first time, 50 of them are going to test negative the second time on that ELISA. In other words, right off the bat, we got 50% false positives. Then, of those 50 who test positive the second time and are given a Western blot, only 40% of them are going to test positive. So in the end, out of 100 people who started off being told they were HIV positive by their first ELISA, only 20 are actually going to end up that way. Now, let's assume, because, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the test, but let's just assume for a moment those tests are accurate. What have we done to these 80 other people? For example, I went to the website of the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, and on their frequently asked questions is a question, what are the risks of testing for HIV? Their answer, please, let me make it clear, this doesn't say what are the risks of having HIV. It says what are the risks of taking the HIV test. They have two. Number one, taking the HIV antibody test is a stressful event regardless of the results. And as you just said, stress lowers your T-cell count. And number two, disclosures of an antibody test result, or sometimes the disclosure that a person even took the test, may lead to discrimination, denial of health coverage, stigmatization, and violence.
What happened to the Hippocratic Oath? The doctor's supposed to keep every patient's file private.
You know, additionally, and of course, the question is any antibody test ordinarily would be said to indicate a prior infection rather than an acute infection.
Absolutely.
And this is a huge matter because people are routinely told they're infected, where even if the positive were true, it's not proof of infection.
No, and even beyond that, Michael, I mean, the entire vaccination theory is based on developing antibodies to a certain germ, like smallpox. In a smallpox vaccine or a polio vaccine, we give a small amount of the germ or a synthetic germ so that the body can identify that, figure out how to defeat it, and then develop the antibodies to it so that it can more successfully and effectively fight that if it shows up again in the future. And so with most diseases, having the antibodies means you're immune to that disease. All of a sudden, now along comes HIV, and we tell people through these tests, well, you have the antibodies to HIV. Oh, but by the way, you're going to die of AIDS. It doesn't make any sense, Michael. It's just one example of how absolutely illogical and ludicrous the HIV/AIDS hypothesis really is.
You know, to me, it has a huge social function. And the social function is all those messy little things don't have to be looked at. It's very profitable. It's very profitable for the medical profession, the biotech profession. It's very profitable for the pharmaceutical industry. It's very profitable for academics and researchers. And it eliminates a lot of messy questions for the gay community. Everyone seems to win except the victims. And that's one of the things that makes me committed and dedicated to challenging it, is that I see that it's a war against people who are at risk. It's a war against the victims.
Absolutely. And to me, we're the crime of it all today is that we are going to create more victims if the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have their way. They announced, and again reiterated this May, that they want everybody in this country tested for HIV. Whenever you would go to a doctor, a hospital, or clinic and give blood, they want an HIV test made part of that blood test. Now, this is going to absolutely magnify the entire criminality of this situation. The reason they say they want to do this is because they believe, by their own estimates, that there may be about 1 million people in this country who are HIV positive, but they say, 300,000 or so don't know it. And so they want to test 300 million of us to find 300,000 that they think are HIV positive so that they can then talk them into taking these lethal HIV drugs. But in the process of finding 300,000, we're going to tell 2 million people who test false positive that they have HIV and ruin their lives. Think of the emotional and psychological trauma, the family stress, the social stigmatization and ostracization, and the financial hardship of being told you're HIV positive. And for your listeners today, if they think for a minute that they don't have, that this issue is not touching them, well, maybe that's true today. But wait until tomorrow when the CDC gets their way, and wait until cities emulate what is being proposed right there in New York City. I don't know whether you saw this. In June 26th or 27th issue of the New York Times, there was an article about opening up an HIV jail in Bellevue Hospital. Did either one of you see this?
I did not.
I didn't see it, but I heard about it.
And this article was written by Professor Baron Lerner. And what he talked about was how New York City recently, not that long ago, treated tuberculosis patients. They would actually do something called direct observation therapy, DOT.
They still do it.
They would go out and find tuberculosis patients and watch them while they took their medications. And if the tuberculosis patient refused or failed to take their medication, they would lock them up for as long as 2 years in a special ward against their will in Bellevue Hospital.
What year was this, Stephen?
This was early 90s through to, actually, it's still open.
It's still happening.
Yeah. And now they want to do, that ward became known as the TB jail. And now they want to open an HIV jail for people who don't or refuse to take their HIV medications if they're designated HIV positive. This is getting serious. This is the worst flagrant attack on civil liberties that I have seen, all in the name of public health.
Especially, I'm sorry, you want to finish?
Ahead.
I was going to say, especially in the whole fact that HIV is still a hypothesis and not a proven disease like TB is. TB probably passed every single one of Koch's postulates.
Absolutely.
And a lot of your book during the trial was based on Koch's postulates. And I just want to read what Koch's postulates are, if you will allow me to.
Absolutely.
Dr. Robert Koch was a bacteriologist, lived in the 1800s. I'd say he came up with Koch's postulates about 100 years ago. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes.
So I'd say in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, these became the standard for proving that there is a cause of a disease, a bacterium, fungus, virus, which would be proven through 4 criteria. And the 4 criteria are, number 1 is that the microorganism, bacteria, fungus, or virus, must be found in every case of the disease, in a diagnosis of a disease, and detectable in the infected host at every stage of the disease. Number 2 is that the causal agent must be able to be isolated from all other microbes and grown independently in a laboratory culture, like in a petri dish. And when someone takes a culture from your throat for, say, strep throat or some sort of blood test, it has to be removed from every other impurity and purified so they can see it under a microscope. Am I correct, Stephen?
Absolutely.
Well, not under a microscope, under an electron microscope.
Electron microscope,
and
yes.
Additionally, what it means is that it has to be completely removed from the cell. Isolation used to mean that something was purified, that you were looking at the substance and nothing but the substance. There is no such sample anywhere on the planet of an HIV.
And number 3 is that when healthy beings, healthy animals such as us or monkeys or whatever is close to us in biological makeup, when they are infected with pathogens from the purified culture, or as Michael said, the completely isolated culture, they must come down with the exact same disease. Number 4 is that the microorganism must be re-isolated from the newly infected person or animal and must correspond to the original microorganism that was isolated or purified. And if it doesn't come to that criteria where all 4 are met, all 4 criteria for Koch's postulates, which are still the standard in the medical industry. Am I right about that?
Absolutely, Adam. These have been used for over 100 years now to determine and verify the cause of any infectious disease.
However, we're talking about using them in looking at a syndrome, which is not a disease.
That's correct.
And this would have been the first hint that something was wrong, because they kept saying syndrome, but they kept acting as if they were dealing with a disease. Now, I disagree with a lot of dissidents because I think the fraud is intentional. A lot of people like the luxury of thinking that there were scientific mistakes, but the major representation in the beginning of the crisis was everyone's at risk. And I can find no scientific evidence anywhere at that time that actually suggested that. All the evidence they had, in my opinion, pointed away from that, really looked at it as this was a problem of toxicology and or behavior. There was no evidence. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely agree with you, Michael. I'm not one that says there was some kind of secret conspiracy. I'm one that says Robert Gallo, excuse me, the man who stood up on April 23rd, 1984 at a press conference and said he had found the probable cause of AIDS, and it was this virus HIV. This man, first of all, is, as one peer called him, a scientific gangster. He stole the virus, tried to claim that he had discovered it. He stole another virus from the Japanese. He stole a culture in which to grow these viruses. He lied on his patent application for the HIV blood test. He's been investigated by not only Congress, but also by the Office of Scientific Integrity and the Office of Research Integrity, all of whom found him guilty of scientific misconduct. This man is a thief and a criminal, and yet this is the man we believed for now 22 years that HIV causes AIDS. This man is a megalomaniac. In my book, Wrongful Death, I talk about Dr. Robert Gallo. He's one of the only two people I name by name in there, because everything I say about him is absolutely true and documented. And this man so much wanted a Nobel Prize, and still does, that he would stand up in front of the world, claim he stole a virus, and claim it caused the disease, when in fact there is no evidence and never has been any evidence, not one scientific paper that proves HIV causes AIDS. To the contrary, as Adam was just reading, HIV fails every single one of Koch's postulates to be called the cause of a disease, and also fails Farr's law, the first epidemiological law of viral and microbial diseases, and it doesn't cluster, so it can't be called infectious or contagious. And we also now have a study, a very famous study by a researcher named Nancy Padian, who proves that HIV is not transmitted by sexual contact either, despite what you hear all over the media.
Roberto Giraldo put out a paper in 1998 that states that. Are you familiar with Dr. Giraldo?
Oh, yes.
So he wrote a big paper on that. I just wanted to mention you went over the parts of the book talking about Gallo stealing these viruses that were sent to him by the Japanese and by the French. He claimed to discover the virus that caused leukemia. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the HTLV1?
Yeah, that was the virus he stole from the Japanese, and the reason we know he stole it is when the Japanese sent that virus to Dr. Gallo to test. See, most scientists who have any worth will make a discovery, they will publish it, they will send it to other scientists that they trust, and see if those scientists can duplicate their study. And when that has happened, then they will make an announcement that they have found such and such to be true. Well, Dr. Robert Gallo didn't do that with HIV at all, but the Japanese did years earlier, and they sent him a virus that they discovered, which he stole because when the Japanese sent it to him, they already didn't trust him so much. They put a fake code in the virus code itself. So it was quite clear when he said he had discovered HTLV1 that, in fact, it was that Japanese virus that they sent to him. Now, the Japanese never pressed charges, and actually, Dr. Gallo, believe it or not, won the Lasker Prize for that discovery a few years later, 1986, I think it was. So, we have to look at what's going on now in the medical and scientific research community and understand that money and prestige have taken precedence over truth and accuracy.
And I think it's important to remind ourselves as well that AIDS is the tip of the iceberg. You could look at lots of different practice of medicine. Right now, millions and millions of children are being drugged with prescription drugs that are the equivalent of illicit drugs like speed and crystal, and they're routinely coerced into taking them based on what could be viewed as a bogus diagnosis. And there are many, many different scenarios where we have a recent case where a cancer victim who was a minor was forced to take treatment against his own will and the will of his parents.
Yeah.
There are so many different examples, in my opinion, and I say this with a preface that I recognize there are parts of medical practice that are life-saving, that are a boon to humanity. But the everyday practice of allopathic medicine is the number one threat to our health and well-being.
So, it is, Michael. Actually, if you believe the studies that Gary Null has made, doctors and hospitals and drugs are the number one killer.
1 million a year.
In the United States. Far exceeding people who were killed by cancer or by heart disease.
So I always like to ask, why is everybody so afraid of AIDS and so trusting of doctors? It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, Stephen, I listened to Gary and I read what he had written about the medical industry killing people, and you mentioned it in the trial in the book, iatrogenic death. And that's what AZT caused, the 300,000 deaths. And I keep telling this to everyone who is stuck in that paradigm of the AIDS zone, like Michael had invented this. It's not, he didn't invent it, but this is his terminology, the AIDS zone. You're brought into it by the media. You're brought into it by your health professionals. I have a friend, a girl, who went to a gynecologist for a problem, and he couldn't find anything, so he said, oh, maybe it's HIV disease. When was the last time you took an HIV test? And the funny thing is, we keep talking about the tests, and you're right, there's a lot more to talk about it. There is no such thing as an HIV test. This is the thing. Or like Hugh Hamilton would say, that's the thing. Yeah. There is no HIV test. And Michael has it on his website, the HEAL website, the inserts. And what do they say on those inserts?
Well, they very clearly say that there's no proof of infection using these tests. Now, this is very important because the person taking the test isn't making an informed decision. Who in their right mind would take a test that isn't proof of what you're testing for? But in terms of what you said in the beginning of the show about thinking that it would be solved by a class action suit, I also felt that way. And we tried to encourage people who were affected to organize and get a lawyer. And we were unable to do that. And then where people did have the courage and the resources to start it, they couldn't afford to do it. Kim Banyan comes to mind. Here's a woman who has an excellent case. And you don't see any movement because it's the kind of thing where everybody walks away from it. And my feeling is that they can buy attorneys and they are able to settle cases out of court where they're gag orders. And where I used to think that we might be able to solve it in a courtroom, I'm not sure how we're going to solve it unless people outright reject medical practice. My opinion would be we need a refuse and resist movement for testing.
Well, I also think that it's a shame that to get life insurance you must take an HIV test. And certain jobs want you to take an HIV test as well. Magic Johnson, the players in the NBA threatened to leave their teams if they were going to play against him. And that's a joke, considering that there's no such thing, in our opinion, as HIV.
Stephen talked about the consequences of testing positive, which I am haunted by because I've seen it over and over again. I've had contact with easily 100,000 people over the years through my involvement with HEAL, and the pattern is predictable. They stop eating. They stop sleeping. They stop taking care of themselves. Very often they quit their jobs. It ends relationships. And in the course of doing all of those things, that promotes getting sick. If you're not eating, if you're not sleeping, if you're not bathing, if you're always afraid, that can undermine your health in a big way.
Well, Michael, just to back up what you're saying, it's been known for years. See, immune deficiency is not in itself a new phenomenon. We've known about it for years, and two of the major causes of immune deficiency, or basically a lower T-cell count, are sleep deprivation and malnutrition. Now, I've watched you, Michael, in a film called The Other Side of AIDS, talk about the bone. The technical term is nocebo. Everybody has heard about placebos, where they're used sugar pills in drug trials to test whether a drug has any kind of value over a sugar pill or not. And a placebo is based on the thought that if it works, it's simply because the person believed it would work. The opposite effect of that, the nocebo effect, is if you tell somebody that something is going to make them sick, it can. And in many cases, it will. And it's just like the Aborigines, as you so well put, would point a bone at one of their own as punishment or as something to let that person know that they had been found, they had been ostracized by the tribe. And that bone pointing at them would make them sick because they believed it would. Now, what are we doing to millions of people, not just in the United States, but in Africa as well, when we tell them they're HIV positive? We're making them sick. This is iatrogenic. This is as much iatrogenic as AZT was in the 80s and 90s in this country. And we killed 300,000 people with AZT back then because AZT caused AIDS. And we're still doing the same thing today. Sometime this has got to stop.
When you talked about one of the characters in your book, Sarah, I had met people who fit that pattern who at the time threatened to sue me, who tried to intimidate me because I was recommending that people think twice before taking high-dose AZT. I have been very careful not to give anyone under any circumstance medical advice. But what I do is put information out there, and I'm certainly free to say that I wouldn't do these things, or I can't believe that I would do these things, and that I think that they're very dangerous. But members of families would call me up and say, if this person refuses medication, it's your fault, and we're going to sue you. And later on, when it was recognized that AZT was actually what killed him, no one ever called up and said, thanks for what you tried to do.
Right.
It's kind of amazing to me.
I just want to interject here. We're going live right now simultaneously, and I just want to give the number. It's 888-873-4643. That's 888-873-4643. We're hoping we get some calls for you, Stephen, because this book is very important. And, we're at a time right now at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time where people are on their way home from work. People are picking up kids from after-school programs. And hopefully they're listening on the Internet around the world. And I'm going to give that number once more, but we need some calls here, 888-873-4643, because this is an important issue, and it's funny how it's hard to reach the general public with this information because once the medical industry had a grasp on it and they keep pushing these HIV tests, it's hard to reach people unless they get it by the media waves, and obviously this is not commercial media. I just also want to mention, could you talk about the press conference from 1984 about Margaret Heckler? In your book, you use a different name for the woman, Mrs. Hartman, I believe. Am I correct?
That's correct. I changed all the names in my book except for Dr. Peter Duesberg and Dr. Robert Gallo. And that's strictly for legal purposes, and it is supposedly a novel, and, there's the normal disclaimer that names and identities have been changed and are just coincidental. But
how did you get away with leaving Dr. Gallo's name in there? Is he?
For two reasons. First of all, if Dr. Gallo should ever try to sue me, the only way he could do it would be for libel and slander, and in court on a libel and slander case, truth is always a defense. And every word I said about Dr. Gallo is absolutely true, documented, and well-researched, so that I am absolutely 100% confident I could prove every word that I said, and I would win any case.
Before you start telling us about the press conference, Michael wants to say something.
And of course, there's a precedence because John Lawrenson, to paraphrase, called him a murderous swine, and there was no response, and this was very clear in Poison by Prescription. He didn't pull any punches. I've been very critical and openly critical of Gallo. I think also he's a murderous swine. And, of course, he was involved, and Broda were involved in introducing AZT as well. So there's a lot of blood on this guy's hands.
Well, the other factor, Michael and Adam, is that I would love Gallo to sue me. I would love to get into court with this, first of all, because I have nothing to lose. You said at the beginning of the program, I'm 60 years old, and you've read some of the things I've done in my life. I've had a fantastic life. If it would end tomorrow, I would say that it was a great life. So, and I have nothing for them to take. I had a serious car accident, broke my neck 3 years ago. And by the way, I want to reiterate that I'm very grateful to medicine and medicine's ability to patch up first aid cases from that viewpoint, or I wouldn't be walking or living today. But of course, all that cost me everything I had saved, and so I have no money for them to take. I have no reputation for them to smear. I don't have a job for them to threaten. I would love it if Robert Gallo and GlaxoSmithKline would try to sue me and take me to court, because I would finally get the court case that I wanted.
So basically, Margaret Heckler kowtowed to Gallo, not even questioning his research or his ambitions as far as announcing HIV was the cause of AIDS at that press conference.
Margaret Heckler had no medical or scientific background when she took over as the head of the Secretary of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services. Strictly a political appointment by Ronald Reagan. I mean, she was a Republican. And she was also a very good businesswoman and manager. And I think what Reagan wanted the most in that department was someone who could, bring business sense to it. But unfortunately, the whole AIDS thing came along while she was there, and she got caught. She didn't have a clue. She didn't have the first idea to ask Robert Gallo whether he had even sent his research around to his peers to be tested and verified. She didn't have a clue to ask Robert Gallo whether the HIV met Koch's postulates or any other test to be called the cause of a disease. All she knew was that he said this was true, and we could now announce to the world finally that we had found the cause of AIDS, and as she said, and hopefully a cure and a vaccine is not far behind. Well, now, 22 years later and $200 billion later, we don't have a cure and we don't have a vaccine, and that's the only real reason, since we've had the best minds and the brightest minds in the business working on this, the only real reason is because we have the wrong cause.
What about the patent application submitted a few hours before the press conference took place?
And Dr. Robert Gallo made $1.7 million in the ensuing years from that patent application on the HIV blood test, which he has admitted he lied about also, because the French actually developed that blood test, and he just stole that from them as well.
LAV.
Yes.
One of the things that I noticed in the press conference, and I agree, Margaret Heckler didn't have the intelligence or the training to really evaluate it, and you could see anyone in that position might want to make an announcement as quickly as possible.
Yes.
But to me, there was another thing she said that was alarming, and that concerned cancer research. And she said that although the idea that finding the virus that caused cancer had been, and I'm paraphrasing, a complete failure, thank God we did the research because we found a probable cause of AIDS. Now, it seems to me that it would be absurd at this point in time to not notice that the hallmark disease of the early AIDS crisis disappeared and remained rigidly confined to a subset of gay men. You don't see KS anymore. This was the hallmark disease, and it was the reason Gallo was involved in the research in the first place. They were looking to connect cancer to a virus.
Well, besides that, Michael, they thought KS was a cancer, and it
Exactly.
turned out not to be.
Yes.
So, again, I totally agree with you that the whole atmosphere in the early 1980s, and I believe you alluded to this earlier, including the desire of the gay community to take the focus away from their lifestyle and away from poppers, which they did not want to give up, and which for the first 3 years the CDC thought caused AIDS because amyl nitrite or poppers destroys the immune system of human as well. They were very anxious to jump on the HIV bandwagon. So there were a number of factors that let Robert Gallo get away with his lie, with his total fabrication of HIV. And unfortunately, today there's so much money invested in it that it's a self-perpetual. Look at the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett and all this pouring $237 million into trying to find a vaccine. This is another amazing thing, gentlemen. We're talking about finding a vaccine for AIDS. Well, what are we always looking for in a vaccine? We're looking at for something we can do to create antibodies to the disease. Well, we already have the antibodies to HIV. That's what we test for. That's when we tell people that they're HIV positive. The antibodies are already there. So what in the world are we even talking about when we say we want to find a vaccine for this? The vaccine has already been created by the human bodies that already have created the antibodies to HIV, and there are literally thousands and thousands of HIV positives in this country who have been living healthy and happy lives for years, both having HIV, if in fact they do, and secondly, without taking these lethal HIV drugs or what is called the highly active antiretroviral therapy, which, if you may have seen this in the August 5th issue of Lancet magazine, there's a brand new study, the longest and largest of its kind, 22,000 patients over 10 years, studying these heart drugs, this antiretroviral therapy drugs. And the conclusion of that study was that the drugs that are being given today to people who are HIV positive are even worse in terms of results from what was being given 10 years ago in 1996. They're causing greater drops in CD4 count. They have not prolonged life one iota, according to this study.
Even prior to that, there was the St. Mary's study. And the St. Mary's study looked at early treatment. That, we've gone through a lot of different strategies, each of them equally harmful in their own right, although nothing was as devastating to watch as high-dose AZT. But in the St. Mary's studies, the doctors admitted that on average, the people who were using these treatments died a year sooner than people who took no treatments.
Yes.
And they said, however, we have to have a reason to encourage people to get tested from a public health stand, and the promise of a treatment has to be put out there. And that to me is criminal.
Exactly. And this is similar to an argument I get fairly frequently when I do these radio programs. I'll have somebody call in and say, you can't tell people that HIV is not sexually transmitted. My God, they'll stop having safe sex. And my response, of course, is I'm not trying to tell people to stop having safe sex. I'm trying to say I don't think we need to lie to them to get them to have safe sex. I think we ought to tell them the truth that, HIV is not sexually transmitted, that the Padian study proved. Here's a very brief summary of the Padian study. Nancy Padian took 175 discordant couples. That means that one person in the couple is HIV positive and one person in the couple is HIV negative. And there were 175 of these couples. And she studied them anywhere from 4 to 6 years. And she was trying to find out how many times they would have to have sex before the HIV negative person would seroconvert, would become HIV positive, would get HIV from the positive person. At the end of her study, not one, and I mean not one, HIV negative in those couples turned to be HIV positive.
They did a study. They did a study in Europe about 10 or 12 years ago with about 100 HIV couples where one was positive, the other was negative, and not one of the 100 ever seroconverted. And who is Padian, by the way? Who is she?
She was a government scientist out of UCLA. And, what's interesting about her study is as you said, there was zero transmission, yet she came up with a figure of 1 in 1,000.
Yeah,
now, that figure is fraud. And how anyone could read the data set in her review, in her study, and not notice the huge contradiction, 0 to 1 in 1,000. And she today continues to be an advocate for the CDC.
But, Michael, were any of those people in the study toxified by some other already established condition like an STD or a
There was zero transmission. You can't discuss that. It's irrelevant.
Yeah,
there was zero transmission. That's the urgent factor.
There was no transmission of
zero,
anything? Right.
Zero.
Okay.
Transmission. So it's a moot point. You said something about gays and their agenda, and I just want to clarify so that people who are listening are clear about what I was saying. What I'm saying is that during the late 70s and early 80s, there was a tremendous
liberation.
There was a tremendous backlash against homosexuality.
Yep.
And if there was any hope for normalizing homosexuality, it was going to be crushed by any link to a disease. And I think that there are a lot of gay men and a lot of gay men who are invisible who don't use drugs, who this is not their lifestyle. And they realized that if this behavior was made public, if people looked at this behavior of a small subset of gay men, that the consequences would set their civil rights back 100 years.
Yep.
They'd be beaten back into the closet. And because the gay community is basically a fiction, you have the visible gays who speak for everybody who's in the closet and don't have a voice. So if they were going to come forward, they'd have to say, wait a second, I'm gay and I don't use drugs and I don't have AIDS. And there was an opportunity to challenge it. The Haitian community in New York City took the Brooklyn Bridge. And they said, our blood is as good as anybody. If you're going to say our blood is tainted, prove it. And within 48 hours, they were taken off the list.
Right.
So the gay community could have taken a stand. They didn't. They allowed the government to get away with this gross misrepresentation because it would be otherwise that no one would know or care about their deaths. In a way, it gave meaning to the deaths. So I don't view them the same way as I view the other people where the collusion isn't based on fear. And they were afraid legitimately.
Absolutely.
This would have been all the evidence the Anita Bryans of the world needed. So I think that there was a collusion in the gay community, and I believe that many people felt it was the lesser of two evils.
We only have 10 minutes, even less than 10 minutes left. So, Steve, I just want to mention once more the book, Wrongful Death, the AIDS Trial, and I just want to know how people can get it.
Well, they can go to my website, which is www.theaidstrial.com. They can also get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's available on the Internet through Amazon.com and so forth. And I also would like to mention another website because we've talked today about the HIV blood tests. And I have put up the bare bones of a second website, which is going to be linked to my second book, which should be out in a couple months, focusing on the HIV blood tests. That website is www.adeathsentence.com, adeathsentence.com. And on that website, you'll just read a very brief outline of the 7 major things wrong with these HIV blood tests, and then a list of 66 different medical and scientific studies to back that up. You see, because I hope nobody listening today thinks that, first of all, I'm out in left field here by myself spouting these things off. I'm not. I'm one of, for example, over 2,300 medical and scientific researchers and doctors and chiropractors and journalists and professionals, all of whom believe that HIV does not cause AIDS. And you can find that list of people at www.rethinkingaids.com. And the list includes Nobel Prize winners and members of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. So I'm just a very small cog in this wheel that is beginning to turn faster and faster, trying to dismantle the lies and the manipulations and the malpractice that has occurred in this issue over the last 22 years. And I am very encouraged that at the moment we seem to be making a little headway because I'm doing a lot of these radio interviews, and you guys are terrific to allow me the time to express my views. And I'm doing a lot. I was just on the Joey Reynolds show, had 5 million listeners last week. So, there are people who I think are ready to hear a different story. I think a lot of factors are involved, and people are beginning to wake up and say, hey, maybe this isn't really everything it's been cracked up to be, and hopefully we'll be able to save some more lives by alerting people to the fact that even though they've been told they're HIV positive, that really may not be true, and that they should take some very serious time and research to consider whether taking these HIV drugs.
Michael?
One of the things that we kind of just brushed against, and I just want to talk about it, is a lot of people don't think they're touched by this. And we're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars. Billions of dollars are being wasted to threaten people who aren't really at risk. And then the practice of medicine was changed by groups of AIDS activists demanding poisons, demanding that they be given untested, unproven treatments. And that has changed medicine because everybody is following that example. And I remember the early movement of ACT UP. I lived in New York. I still do. And, it was, we want these drugs even if they kill us. And they did kill them. And so that there's this huge effect that this has, even if you think, well, I'm not gay, I'm not a drug user, why should I be concerned? You should be concerned because really valuable research isn't being done.
Well, aside from that, Michael, statistically, if the CDC has their way to begin testing everyone for HIV on a blood test, if it's not the person who's listening to me right now, and even if it's not someone they know or someone they love, it's going to be somebody they work with. The numbers are eventually going to catch up with people, and they are definitely going to be affected by this, and it is not going to be fun when it happens.